From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Steve Levingston, nonfiction editor of the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. Many of us have seen the photos of the chaos in Saigon in April 1975 as the North Vietnamese Army was moving into the city. There's that image of U.S. government personnel on the roof of the American embassy trying desperately to get on a waiting helicopter. But there was another evacuation underway in quieter fashion during those closing days of the Vietnam War. And leading this dramatic effort was John Riordan, an assistant manager for Citibank's Saigon branch. As the city was falling, Riordan had been ordered by his bosses to get out, which he did, flying to nearby Hong Kong. But once there, he couldn't stop thinking about those he left behind, people he knew and worked with, and so many of them. Scores of his stranded South Vietnamese coworkers were facing possible death at the hands of the communists. So Riordan went back to Saigon at great risk, and there unfolded the remarkable story he tells in his book, They Are All My Family, a daring rescue in the chaos of Saigon's fall. I'll let him tell you the amazing details, but suffice it to say, he worked a miracle to save 106 innocent Vietnamese from Lord knows what during the communist takeover. These were his colleagues, his friends, their families, and he used stunning ingenuity to pull it off, turning these men, women, and children into family, fooling the bureaucrats eyeing their exit papers. Today, 40 years later, these Vietnamese and their American-born descendants call John Riordan Papa. Riordan's book is both a thrilling read and a fitting tribute to his compassion. As one reviewer said, it's a nail-biting account of one man's quiet heroism in the face of impossible odds. So please join me in welcoming this modest hero, John Riordan.
Thank you, Steve. The lights are kind of like that interrogation room I thought I might face someday, but luckily, different place. I'd like to just mention two people out of many, many people who are mentioned in my book acknowledgments, who I am eternally grateful to in many ways for bringing me to this date and getting this book published. But the two people who I'd like to mention who are right here on premises are Riordan, who's co-director of the National Book Festival, and Stacia Anderson, who has held my hand and answered all my phone calls and assured me that everything would go just fine. So if I could just step back in history, because you just heard all the stuff that happened in 1975, and tell you that in 1965, 66, I was finishing my master's degree in business administration in Chicago. And I was coming home, living with my parents, turning on Walter Cronkite, and watching the evening news. Every day of that last year of graduate school, the evening news got worse and worse and worse in my memory as to what was happening, the troop involvement for the United States in Vietnam increasing, the violence. And friends were telling me, you know, John, you've got three choices. And by the spring of 1965, I thought those three choices were Canada. And I said, I've been there and done that. I like the country. The second one was jail. My dad was a Chicago police officer in the juvenile division, and he took my brother and I down to the local Rogers Park station a couple times and let us cool our heels in a cell, but he never locked the door. We did appreciate that part. And the third one was sign up for the Army, because I was going to be drafted for sure. And my brother was just coming home from that time with a little bit of a background in the Peace Corps, the U.S. Peace Corps. And he said, John, you know, you've always been interested in hospital administration, and you're working in a hospital now in the finance office, getting through graduate school. Why don't you apply for a direct commission in the Army Medical Service Corps? So I took Bill's advice and I took the test, and lo and behold, I got a letter or a telegram that said, you're now Second Lieutenant John Riordan, Army Medical Service Corps. Your report for duty at Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, Texas, early September. And I moved on right down there to a class of a couple hundred other young men. And what really shocked me at the beginning was most of the training we got was in the treatment of nuclear battlefield wounds. And I thought, uh-oh, what am I getting into? By the end of the 90 days, everybody got orders, and most everybody in my class was ordered to a place called Vietnam, which I certainly knew about by that time. My orders read Army Surgeon General's office, Washington, D.C., a really nice town, a sleepy little city in 1965, or 66 rather, and a great job. I was aide to the general in charge of the command, who was a terrific man, but I do think I could salute a little better than he could. But they were all were doctors and nurses and specialists in the medical fields of the U.S. Army. And Washington was a party town too, and I was relatively young, and I certainly enjoyed myself. And one day, kind of late in 1966, my year and a quarter or what in the Army Medical Service Corps, I walked into a bull session with Colonel McBride, who was in charge of personnel. And Colonel McBride said, "You're late for the bull session, Johnny, but don't worry about a thing. Lieutenant Sundin and the other lieutenant from the Judge Advocate General's Corps have figured it all out." And I said, "What's that, Colonel?" He said, "What to do with the hippies from Haight-Ashbury?" I said, "Well, what are you going to do, Colonel?" He said, "We're going to send them to the front line." I said, "Oh, Colonel, I'm from Chicago, and I always voted for the Chicago Cubs," and he got the message that I didn't agree. He said, "Don't you agree with our decision?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir, that's correct. I don't agree." He said, "Gentlemen, get your butts out of this office. Coffee hour over." 2 weeks later, I got orders to Vietnam. But before I left, Colonel McBride said, "Johnny, I want to tell you one thing. I got you a really good job over there." And I thought, what mountain, what foxhole could he be talking about? But as it turned out, I was assigned to a spook unit, which was called a clandestine organization called Studies and Observations Group in Vietnam. And it sounded like an intellectual group, something like the Surgeon General's office back in Washington, and I thought McBride was right. Only it turned out we were undercover, and we were doing cross-border operations in the north, in Laos and Cambodia, and I was in charge of medical resupply, working out of the old Italian embassy in Saigon. When I arrived in Saigon for that assignment, all hell had just broken loose in the last couple of weeks. It was the Tet Offensive of 1968, and I wanted to get out of the country as soon as I could, legally, and finish my tour and go home back to Chicago. But things worked out that it began to settle down, the activity, and I began to meet friends, journalists, other foreigners, non-military people, military people, different militaries, Australians, Koreans, etc., and fitting into a groove in a cove that I began to see the brighter sides of Vietnam, and the nice restaurants and the great swimming pool that was available, and I fell in love with Vietnam, despite the violence when I first arrived there. About a year into my career in the Army, I had a choice, and I learned about it kind of suddenly. I could leave and go for 6 months, the last 3 months of a 3-year commitment to the Army at Fort Carson, or I could up for 3 months more in Vietnam and get a 3-month drop. And so I chose the latter because I had quite a group of friends that I enjoyed being with, and I stayed on for 3 more months. When I finished that time, one of my friends said, "Would you like to do some traveling?" I used to be a travel agent, and I said, "Yeah, I'd like that." And when I went in to tell them that I was leaving, I finished my tour and commitment was up and did the extra time, they said, according to our records, you've never had a vacation day in 3 years. And so here's that money in cash, and here's that money it would take to fly you home. And are you crazy staying here? And I said, no, I'm not. But soon enough, I started traveling with my friend. We traveled for 6 months, and through Southeast Asia, Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, Africa, all of Europe that I can think of, and then up into Russia, and at Moscow and Leningrad for about 10 days. And in Moscow, I was walking down the main lobby of the Hotel Russia on Red Square, and this woman came up to me and introduced herself and said, I am the manager of this hotel, and I understand that you are a returning U.S. military officer from Vietnam, and you're going back home after your assignment in Vietnam. I said, your information is certainly very good. And she said, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Russian people, the Soviet people, for your service. And I said, would you please explain that to me? And she said, look, the Soviet Army has 60 divisions on the border with Mongolia and with China. We are very happy you're keeping those people down at the other end of the earth busy. I got it and left, went back, headed back to Chicago, home for Christmas, my sister's wedding, and then it was time to look for a job. And I wanted to go back to Asia, so I started applying for any job that would get me back to Asia. I got a telegram from a nice bank in New York, and they said, come out and we'd like to interview you. I went, I was interviewed. They said, you don't know much about accounting. We know you got an MBA, but you're not a great accountant. We're looking for a really great accountant. So there's the door. But I happened to have a friend from Continental Illinois National Bank there at the time, and he said, come and have dinner with me. I'm having dinner with a couple New York bankers, or young like us, and tell them about what you're looking for. I did. They said, take your resume, go over to First National Citibank on 399 Park Avenue in New York, and apply tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp. I never heard of Citibank, I said, or FNCB as it was called in those days. And they said, oh, it's a large bank, big in the international world, and just tell them you're there to interview for an international position in the Asia Pacific branch. I did that. A man came down and said, come up with me. You've picked the right day. You're a lucky fellow to be here. And I had interviews all day long. By the end of the day at 5 o'clock, I was ushered into the Senior Vice President's office of the Asia Pacific Division. He said, you're just the man we're looking for with all that military experience. You'll be great in Asia with the bank. You're hired. So it was a wonderful day for me. And within a month, I was back out there and spent about 6 months in New York training with the Japanese desk officer on Japan, then assigned to Japan as the token gaijin, meaning white devil for Asia Pacific in Osaka branch of Japan. And that following year, I was there for 2 years. The board of directors decided to have their annual board meeting with wives and relatives and hangers-on in Kyoto. And I was pushed to the front of the line because the Japanese people did not want to be dealing with all these senior people from Citibank, chairman of the board and wife and so on. So I got to meet a lot of people in Citibank quickly. After that, I was sent on to an assignment in the Philippines for about 9 months, back to New York to travel around the country for a little bit, looking at, talking to students who wanted to join Citibank. Most of them were Asian students. All of them wanted to work for the bank in the United States. The bank wanted to work for the bank in Asia, so I didn't hire too many people. But it was a good experience. And then I walked into the boss's office, the man who hired me, the senior vice president, Rick Wheeler, and he said, John, we've got this opening in Vietnam in the new Saigon branch that we've just established there. It's a credit job. Would you possibly be interested in it? I know you were there in the Army, and maybe you have no interest in going back. I said, Rick, I hated the war, but I love Vietnam. I'd like to accept that job. So off I was to Saigon and met my new boss. His name was Mike McTighe, a good Irishman, I believe, but a tough boss, very smart, former Marine. And I was in charge of credit. We had a wonderful staff of 33 people, local Vietnamese, all who were much smarter than I was. So it was nice to be in that environment where I could learn, and they were generous in sharing the information they had about banking. Since the Paris Peace Accords had just been signed in late 1972, why Vietnam was a quiet place. You could drive around, never at night, I don't think, but you could drive around and feel comfortable and go on little vacations like down to Vung Tau, the beach resort, and things like that. There was no shooting or bombing or rocketing or anything like that. So the bank was optimistic, I was optimistic, the clients were optimistic, more foreign firms were coming in, we were doing more business, everything was great. So it got to be about end of early March or late April or late February, my boss, Mike McTighe, said, I'm going off on my annual leave, going to go on a skiing trip in Switzerland. You're in charge of the bank here until I get back. And I may spend about 10 days or 2 weeks at head office in New York, so take over and run the ship. I said, fine. I was happy he was out of my hair for a while, and I could do what I wanted, and all the staff knew more than any of the details I did, so the bank ran like a well-oiled machine. And by the middle of March, a good friend of mine from Denmark sent me a letter and said, I'd like to come and visit you, but is it safe to be there? And I fired back a telegram. In those days, we didn't have email, and said, well, of course, there's nothing, no problems here, come, it's peacetime. A little did I know what was happening in other parts of the country that outsiders did know. And he came, and we went down after our 5.5-day work week to Vung Tau, to the beach resort, about a 2-hour drive. Had a nice swim, and it was so palatial down there. It was almost like paradise. Sitting in a restaurant that night, television was on, and suddenly the television was interrupted, and the sound was turned up, and people were talking and translating and everything. There had been an incursion into the north of Vietnam, into the central highlands of Vietnam, with regular NVA troops, North Vietnamese troops. And I couldn't believe it. And I said to Henning, my friend, we've got to get out of here and get back to Saigon fast. He said, let's go now. I said, no, there's one principle, don't travel at night. So first light next morning, we were on the road. We drove back, no problems, got to Saigon. It was the same city we left, quiet, although busy commercially, people on the street, motorcycles, cars, commerce, no change, no fear, no extra military presence. What were they talking about on that television program? So I settled back into being the manager or acting manager of the bank, and I've got to watch my watch here because I've been told that sometimes I'm going to get a sign. I started sending telexes to New York saying, you know, everything is safe here and fine despite the program we heard. Don't be concerned. We've got everything in control. Signed, Riordan. And a couple days after being back, Herman Cockrell from the Bank of America, and they were a bigger bank. They had been a military operation for 10 years, and we were only there about 2 years at that time. And Cort Tremaine got on the phone and said, could we come over and visit you today? And I thought, yeah, well, I'm the little guy in the block. Both of those banks are much bigger, 3 times my size. Why should they want to talk to me? I said, sure. So they came over, and my secretary showed them into the office, and we sat down and said, would you like coffee? The secretary brought in the coffee, and they said, could we close the door? And I said, okay. So I got up and closed the door. Next question was, do you have a map of Vietnam? I said, yes, there's one over here on the desk. I got the map, spread it out on the coffee table in front of us, and they took out their pens and they started Xing out provinces to the north and to the west of Saigon in the country of Vietnam that had fallen to the communists already. That was a surprise to me. And maybe I wasn't listening to BBC, and NPR wasn't broadcast there at the time, and PBS, I don't think they got through either. But they came over every day for the next several days, and I said, why don't I just come over to your branches? Oh, please don't do that. Our staff has been here 10 years. They are very knowledgeable about the politics of everything. We don't want the wrong signal sent. We'll come to you. I said, okay. And each day they came, each day the pens were taken out. The map, which we had hidden behind a painting in the office of the manager, we took off the wall, turned it over, pulled out the map, spread it out, more provinces falling. And my recollection, there are about 70 provinces in Vietnam, but that you could see this movement down toward us. Yet nothing was a problem. The newspapers were carrying some stories, but in a number of them there were patches of white like the censors had cut something out. But we were not very well informed. These older bankers from those two big banks knew more than I did. And then one day they said, we're going to have a meeting with the economics attaché of the embassy at a little hotel around the corner down here in a quiet little secret location. Would you come? And we'll just hear what the embassy's thinking. I said, sure. So that was going to be on April 3rd, I believe, at about 8:30 in the morning. I came into my office that day. Betty, my secretary, said, oh, you just got a call from the Pan Am office, and they would like you to come over there. A call has come in from New York for you, from Citibank, New York, and the telephone system in New York, or in Vietnam, was kind of mixed up and confused, and so I didn't think much of it, just walking a couple blocks over there. I got to the Pan Am office. There were a lot of people in the Pan Am office, and I thought, why are all these people here? But I didn't think much about it, because I saw Al Topping in the back, who was the head of Pan Am in Saigon, waving to me. He said, John, go into this office right here, take all the time you need, and you can answer your call from New York. And I picked up the phone, and I said, hello, John Riordan, and the voices on the end said, John Riordan, this is Tom Krause and Peter Howell. We have authority from the highest levels of Citibank, and we're passing this information on to you. You are ordered as of this minute to close that bank in Saigon. We have a 747 aircraft coming into Tan Son Nhut Airport tomorrow morning, April 4th. It'll be there at 2 o'clock, and you're to be on it, and you're to bring all the staff and all of their immediate families. I said, well, and then they said, and take the keys to the vault and the key records of the bank over to the governor of the central bank. That's when I really spoke up, and I said, no, I won't do that, because I thought if I went over to the central bank with this message that I'm closing our bank at this time, I will be in some dungeon in the lowest level of that bank on the Saigon River, and it might flood. So I didn't want that at all. So they said, all right, then take it all over to the ambassador. I said, I don't know Ambassador Graham Martin, only by name. They said, do you know the economics attaché? I said, yes, Jim Ishida, and I'm supposed to be in a meeting with him right now with these other bankers, B of A and Chase. And they said, go and tell those other bankers that they are welcome to join you and any of their staff. They can get out of the country and get on that plane and get out of there. And I said, okay. And they said, we emphasize this comes to you from Walt Wriston, the chairman of Citibank. And when I heard that, I thought, there's nothing I can do to argue about this. So I went over to the meeting, knocked on the door, and they said, come in. And it was a little kind of 15th class hotel. It wasn't too nice. Herman Cockrell from Bank of America is sitting on a single bed in the room. Cor Tremaine is sitting next to him. Jim Ishida is standing there lecturing them. And they said, John, you're late, but don't worry, this is the thing. The economics attaché has explained that the ambassador has said that we have nothing to worry about. It'll be 6 months or more before they get anywhere as near the South Vietnam provinces where we're living now. And so we'll have a review in about 6 months. And I said, gentlemen, that's fine, but I just got off the phone with Citibank New York. I've been ordered to close the branch as of today. We have the 747 coming in tomorrow. I told them the details. And I said, before I said anything, Herman Cockrell said, I'll be goddamned. And I said, are you with me? And Herman Cockrell jumped up and ran out the room, and Cor Tremaine jumped up and ran out with him. And Jim Ishida started waving his arms and saying, the ambassador will have a fit. And I said, well, sorry about the ambassador. I've got to go too. Nice to see you. So I went back to my bank, and of course, we were getting all kinds of telex instructions and telephone calls from our area headquarters in Hong Kong. And I called the senior members of the Vietnamese staff together, told them what I had learned, told them what we were going to do, and they said, well, if we close this bank, all the male members of the staff will be immediately subject to draft into the military. So you can't close the bank. So we all started working in our own ways about communicating with New York and communicating with the regional office about closing the foreign exchange side of the bank and continuing the piastre local currency side until we figured out some way to get these people out, because they all knew there was no way they could get through the military checkpoints at the airport. They didn't have exit visas, they didn't have passports, and they didn't have the means to leave the country. So finally that was agreed upon by Citibank New York and Citibank Saigon and Citibank Hong Kong, and then we were told to burn all of the safety paper and traveler's checks and documents and other manuals, everything but the code book, which you needed to communicate with. So we started big fires, and I was so worried about all the fire that was going on in the manager's window well outside of the office I was in, but no police came, no fire department came, no one came. The fire burned it all up, and I was sitting on the telex shooting a message to somebody in New York or Hong Kong, and suddenly the telex paper went shooting up in the air like this, and the message came across. It said, "John Riordan, you're wanted by the U.S. ambassador at the embassy now." And I sat and typed back a little answer and said, "I think this might be misdirected. You might have meant it for someone else, not me." And they said, "Riordan, come to the embassy right now." So I went downstairs, said to Mr. High, had a nice little Mercedes that the bank rented, "Would you drive me over to the embassy?" When I got there, the doors of the embassy opened. The Marines saluted me like I was somebody other than just a little old banker. A man pressed the button 5 on the elevator, and I went up to the 5th floor. There were 6 floors in the building. I walked into this room with 50 people with suits like this, their backs to me, and a little old man over there in the corner in a very big office with white hair, standing, kind of holding court. He said, "And here is Mr. Riordan, and he's the manager of Citibank or FNCB Saigon, and he's going to close his bank tomorrow. He's going to take all of his staff and their families out on a plane he's chartered, and they're coming into Tan Son Nhut Airport." And I said, "Yes, Mr. Ambassador, those are my orders." And he said, "Well, Mr. Riordan, I want you to cancel that plane, and I want you to come over to have dinner with Mrs. Martin and I tonight, and we'll talk about all this." And I said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Ambassador, but I have my orders, and I'm carrying them out." And he said, "I believe that you bankers are precipitating the fall of South Vietnam." So the weight of that decision was on our shoulders now, especially mine. And he then went over and did this Pontius Pilate washing of his hands, the ritual washing. He grabbed a towel out of the air and wiped him off. And he said, "You will get no help from me. You will get no help from the embassy. And you will get no support from the United States government. Now get the F out of my office." And it was like an explosive evaporation. We were all suddenly out walking on the sidewalk before we remembered what had happened. And I went back to the bank, continued all of that. Next day, the other bankers and I, there were a total of 10 of us on the airport, on the aircraft. It had been downgraded by this time because they knew we couldn't get local staff out, from a 747 to a 707. We all went up to Hong Kong. We worked for 10, 15 days up there, all kinds of evacuation plans that the bank was willing to spend tens of millions of dollars to accomplish. And finally, then the pressure from the banks in New York and wherever else they were put pressure on the embassy to bring us back to Saigon. So the details are in the book. I haven't seen the card yet, so I guess I've got a little more time to tell you. Okay. And the invitation to come back to Saigon was from the deputy ambassador, Liam Martin. And so I was asked if I'd like to go. I was told I didn't have to. And I went, and I got 3 briefings. I had to come in and out the same day. Those were my orders from my new boss, the regional head in Hong Kong. My first briefing was with the political section of the embassy. They pulled out boxes full of computer paper and said, 627,000 Vietnamese names are on these lists. your staff are all already included. Don't worry about a thing. We're going to evacuate all these people when the time comes. I didn't believe any of it, but I went on to the next briefing with the CIA. And the CIA officer who briefed myself and Jim Ishida, who was carrying me around through the embassy, he took 45 minutes to tell us that they had agents throughout the country and nothing would happen for at least 6 months, and resupply was on its way, and don't worry about a thing. Again, it seemed to be against everything I was hearing in the rumor mill and from the people back in New York, et cetera. So I said, okay. And then Jim Ishida said, now your next briefing is with Colonel Wiley out at the defense attaché's office. I said, how come Colonel Wiley isn't here at the embassy advising the ambassador? He said, because they're not getting along. I said, oh. So we went out to the defense attaché's office and went up this long hallway. It used to be called Pentagon West in the days when I was there in the military. Huge building complex out at the airport. And we walked up to Colonel Wiley's office, and Jim Ishida went to the secretary and said, Mr. Riordan's here to get a briefing. The ambassador has sent him. Colonel Wiley's supposed to brief him. And she said, oh, yes, just a minute. She ran into the office. We could hear her saying to this, and he said, I have no time to be briefing any GD bankers about what the situation is. And then Ishida ran in there and said, the ambassador insists that you brief Mr. Riordan. Okay, send him in. So I walked in, and I walked up to his desk, and there was a chair there, and I kind of pulled it out. I thought I'd sit down. He said, don't pull that chair out. I'm not going to give you more than 60 seconds. Stand up. Here's the deal. They have 10 divisions surrounding this city right now. NVA, Viet Cong. We have one division, and he might have said two. I can't remember this exactly. So it was 1 or 2 divisions defending the city of South Vietnamese soldiers. He said, you see that plane out there on the tarmac? I said, yes, sir. He said, get your butt out of my office, get out on that plane, and get the heck out of this country just as soon as you can. And I said, yes, sir. And I felt, I met truth here, not back at the embassy. And Jim Ishida then began his jumping up and down again and said, but my wife and my children are still here. The ambassador's been telling us it's at least 6 months, nothing's going to happen. He said, you want to believe the ambassador, or do you want to believe the defense attaché's office? He said, John, do you think you can get out to that airplane? I said, I think I can walk out that far, yeah, Jim. And he said, I'm going to get my wife and kids out of here. So I was back, took the message back to the regional office, and then the big guy shot from George Voigt, who was his name, an executive vice president, who had been my boss, the head of Japan when I was there, so I knew him. And he called a conference pretty soon, and he had us all sit down. McTighe had come back from his skiing trip in Switzerland, and Walker, the operations officer who he had sent out a few weeks before all this started, was there. Freitag, the head of the region, was there, and George explained everything, all the information they had. He said, we know you guys have been trying to get helicopters, other planes, ships with landing pads, and none of that, despite all our willingness to spend whatever number of millions of dollars it'll take to do it, has been successful to get those people out. So a decision has been made, again at the highest level of the bank, which included Walt Wriston, the chairman, has been made that we will follow the U.S. government on this. And I said, but George, we don't believe the U.S. government. He said, John, I know, but I'm only the messenger here. And he went around to each one of us, and when he got to me, he said the same thing to the other guys. Johnny, you will not go back to Vietnam. And if you do, you go back alone. We all knew what that meant. And he said it to each one of us and called us by name. And I said, yes, George. And then the meeting was over, and we walked out of there, and my boss, Mike McTighe, he said, John, would you like to have a little dinner with me tonight? You've done such a great job. I'd just like to say thanks. And I said, sure, George. And he said, let's meet over at what restaurant do you want? I said, the Hilton for the steakhouse. Good, we'll see there at 6 o'clock or something. But a few nights before that, which I wasn't supposed to talk about, Mike said, we were sharing a room because the telephone was ringing all night long from places all around the world trying to arrange all these escape patterns and mechanisms. And we'd pick up that phone sometimes and talk, and next morning ask one another, did you get that call? Do you remember what they said? Because we were really exhausted. And he said, just a few days before this meeting, I have some Marine friends, and they suggest that as a fallback position, if everything doesn't work out, we contact Jim Eckes. He's supposed to be a guy from the agency, quote unquote, that agency. And he said, would you come to my room between 1 and 3? He might show up anytime during that period. And I agreed, and Jim knocked on the door one night, late at night, and he came in, and he said, what's the story? McTighe explained that we want to get all these families out, and it's 106 people, we think, and can he help us, because we're not getting any help from anybody else? And he said, yes. And we said, well, you know, what do we have to do for you? And he said, here's the number of my Swiss bank account, and you put this amount in there. The amount's in the book, so here's one little reason to buy the book. And he said, good. And he went to the door and opened it and just about went out, and then he closed it and he walked back in. He said, there's just one caveat. I have to know someone who I know now who's going to be back there when I'm in Saigon. So we both said yes, but then I learned that McTighe's passport had been pulled by the bank. They had tackled him in the halls of the Hilton Hotel, or the Mandarin, I guess it was. And he was known as a maverick, and they just were afraid he might go off the deep end, which obviously he was already doing. And that was that. And when I got back at that dinner, Mike said to me, we had a scotch, and he said, before I even got my steak, I think it was just in front of me, I was cutting, and I was about to have one big piece, and he said, you know, John, one of us has to go back. And he gave me 15 reasons why he couldn't. He had 3 wives and a bunch of kids, and I wasn't married. And then he told me about the passport, that he didn't have a passport anymore, and I still did. And he said, would you go, John? So I went, and I've been told that I have just a few minutes left, so I encourage you to take a look at the book and see just how it was done. And if there are any questions for the audience, I'd love to hear them and take them. And it's nice to see you when I block those big, bright lights out there. Thank you very much. So if there are no questions, then I will adjourn the meeting and wish you all the best. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.